but about saving civilian lives in Gaza. I start to worry that these peace negotiations are a charade. Yes, there was one deal reached back in November where a 4-day ceasefire was agreed to, as well as an exchange of 50 hostages for 150 Palestinian prisoners. But the longer this goes on, the more people on both sides will be killed, and the pressure will be on Israel to end it, which is why Sinwar seems to believe they have Israel right where they want them. Joining us now is Mark Ginsburg. He served as a deputy senior advisor to the president for Middle East policy under President Carter and special envoy for Middle East trade and security under Clinton. Also with us is Morgan Ortagus, former State Department spokesperson. Good to see you both. Morgan, let me start with you. It does feel at times as if it's not even worth negotiating with Hamas. They have to do it. But how do you deal with a party in this negotiation who's acting in such bad faith?
Well, this is what Hamas wanted since the beginning of October 7th, Dan, and exactly, as you said earlier, why Sinwar and why Hamas took these hostages, because they wanted this sort of leverage over Israel. I think it's also incredibly important. I always want to note that at the top of these conversations, that we do still have 5 Americans that are still left behind, that are detained by Hamas, by a terrorist organization, and it's incumbent upon this administration to also do everything they can to get Americans home. Back to your original question, the only reason that Hamas moved in the fall for those 2 different ceasefires is because they had so much military pressure. They wanted to get out from under that military pressure. Ergo, they decided to make a deal. The strategic error that we've seen over the past 3 or 4 months, especially since the weeks leading up to Ramadan, is that the Biden administration, in my opinion, has placed too much pressure on Israel. And whenever you don't publicly support Israel, whenever you put more public pressure on Israel than Hamas, Hamas takes that as a signal that they suddenly have the upper hand in these negotiations. Think about what happened just last week. There was bipartisan sanctions in the House against the ICC for going after Netanyahu and the defense minister at the ICC with arrest warrants, supposedly with charges. That was a bipartisan negotiation vote that happened in the House in support of those sanctions. The Biden administration was whipping against the ICC sanctions. And then, of course, we saw at the UN just 2 days ago, the Biden administration again supporting a ceasefire resolution that made them look like they were Hamas's personal lawyer. These things make deals impossible.
I'm not so sure, Mark Ginsburg, that this is as purely political as Morgan is laying it out. And sort of, to me, I place more of the blame here directly on Hamas, and the notion that sort of Hamas would be changing their position if there was a different negotiating ploy. It seems to me that Hamas is ready to have as many civilians die as possible. They don't want a deal. And as a result, regardless of the politics of it, it's going to make it very tricky. Do you disagree, Mark?
No, actually, I agree with you, although Morgan made some very valid points. James Baker, who was Secretary of State under President George H.W. Bush, had a great expression. He said what he has to contend with is what he called dead black cat diplomacy. On either side right now, neither Mr. Netanyahu nor the head of Hamas, Sinwar, wants to have that dead black cat laying at their doorstep. In other words, Sinwar is prepared to die to the last Palestinian. He wants to make sure that if there is going to be a ceasefire, it is permanent. Why? Because no matter how badly battered Hamas's military and terrorist battalions have taken from the Israelis, he wants to survive and ultimately force his way back into the leadership role of the Palestinian movement and overthrow the Palestinian Authority. He believes that he can emerge victorious from whatever tunnel he is because the United States and the rest of the international community more or less has given him a pass. Because why? There's no pressure on him. Other than the military pressure, what is he going to do? I suggested what we need is a $1 billion bounty on his head to give to the first Palestinian who delivers it on a stick. Then we may get results.
Yeah. Let me play a little bit more of what Secretary of State Blinken said today. This is number 2.
The war that Hamas started on October 7th with its barbaric attack on Israel and on Israeli civilians will go on. More people will suffer. But in the days ahead, we are going to continue to push on an urgent basis with our partners, with Qatar, with Egypt, to try to close this deal.
You know, one of the other things I worry about, Morgan, is Qatar as a partner, right? I mean, I don't know that they're sort of an objective player in all of this.
You know, I have a long background working with the Qataris, and the last administration, the Trump administration, we obviously did our Taliban negotiations with them, and it was in Qatar. I do think that, you know, Qatar is in a incredibly difficult situation because they do try to host these negotiations and try to they're in an unenviable spot, similar to the Egyptians trying to get to a deal. But unfortunately, they are working with people like Hamas that really ultimately don't listen to them. So you do have to sort of question, as you said, Dan, the efficacy of using Qatar, of continuing to use them as the intermediary whenever you haven't had much success, which is why I go back to, I think it was a strategic mistake by Prime Minister Netanyahu not to go into Rafah earlier.
Do they not have another choice, Mark?
Sorry.
I mean, do they have another choice but to go to deal with Qatar and Egypt?
Listen, I've long been in favor of kicking Hamas out of Qatar, the political leadership. But it's quite clear that the political leadership has very little control over what Sinwar and his terrorist thugs are doing in Gaza. So you may get a Pyrrhic victory by kicking them out. But what pressure really does Qatar have, other than the fact that Qatar was a conduit for major funding of Hamas? And I don't know if that money is still continuing under the table or not. Qatar plays both sides against the middle repeatedly.
Yeah. All right. Mark Ginsburg and Morgan Ortagus, thank you both so much for coming on the program. Really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you.